Today, I want to share a little bit about my book, sort of giving a little summary without giving any spoilers. Uh, this is a project that I've been working on for a very long time, and I'm excited that it's finally come to an end. When I started this project, it must have been 2019 when I began the writing process. At the time, I had just lost my job, and in the middle of trying to figure out what to do, I began to write a book. Actually, the first time I attempted to write a book should have been when I was in college. I think it must have been around final year. I had begun writing a book titled The Family. It was just a little book talking about my final year. There was a grouping that we had we had come together, a couple of friends and I, and we used to call each other the family. So I started writing a book about what was happening with us, but things took a turn there. So I opted to not do that. But in 2019, when I got made redundant at my work, I had a lot of free time and I realized that I have a real passion for writing. And so I began to embark on this journey. And the first thing that I came up with was the title, actually, First Class Citizen of a Third World Country, which is a little bit provocative for some, but basically it's telling a story of my life. And my life, I've seen myself go from being born into humble beginnings, and that's how the book starts. Actually, the book starts with my parents' beginnings. It talks of where my parents came from. It's hard to talk of my background without talking about my parents. So I talk of where my parents grew up. My dad, he grew up in a very rural part of Malawi called Nkoma in the central region. And till this day, it's still very rural. At my dad's village, they still don't have running water. They don't have access to electricity. And that's where his life began. And my mom was in similar circumstances, but she grew up in Kapanga village in Kota, which is close to the Lake Malawi. It's one of the lakeshore districts, and that's where their stories began. And so I talk about, I think the first chapter in the book, the title, rightly so, is "There's no inherited wealth in the motherland." And so I talk of how my parents were not born into any sort of wealth. My parents were not born into money. My parents were not born into any type of privilege, which is the starting point for most Malawians. My parents were born children of subsistent farmers, and my mom's side, they were teachers, but they were always subsistent farmers as well. And so that's how their story began. And I talk about how the hardships of growing up in the village. And it's crazy. Every time my dad is telling me the stories of his life in the village, I just think it's wild. Like, there he was, no access to water, no access to running water, no access to electricity. He tells me about how he didn't own very many clothes, and that was just normal. And I think that's dirt poor. And yet he tells me that there were people within his vicinity who were worse off than him, and I just find that crazy. On my mom's side, I mean, my mom's parents were teachers, so they were a tad bit better off. And but still, she tells me of, and I see it till today, the typical village life of a young girl in the village. Waking up early to go and draw water for the family, cooking on firewood stoves, if we can call it a stove. It's just you place some stones and. Yeah, that was their background and how education saved their life. And they grew up like post-independence. My parents were both born in '66, so they grew up right around the time when the colonial rule had come to an end, and then we'd entered into the dictatorial rule of His Excellency Kamuzu Bandam, and yeah, their story is beautiful. So they go from the village, they get an education, and They find their way to the big city. And that's where they then had me, their first baby boy, a bouncing baby boy, a bringer of joy, a bringer of hope. And so, yeah, in my book, I talk of how I come into the play. My parents get married. They have me shortly after, and there they are grinding in their careers, trying to move up in the world, trying to do big things, and God is on their side. My dad starts to see some real career progression, and my brother comes into the story. We're growing up. We start off our school, our education. I talk about my time at the Eton of Africa. I have very fond memories of the Eton of Africa. I really love my time at Kamuzu Academy. And Kamuzu Academy is, till today, I think it's one of the best schools in the world. And I would highly recommend it for anyone, especially Malawians. I feel like we need to take advantage of the treasure that we have right here. That is Kamuzu Academy. And at Kamuzu Academy, that was a boarding school. And, I share my interaction with boarding school. Being a little kid, you go to boarding school at 11 years old, and it's now a competition between learning values from home, from your parents, and then learning from your peers and your surroundings. Boarding school is a whole different ballgame. And in my book, I share my experience. I talk of how I went back home in the first term, and I was bothering my parents about how, all the other kids, all the cool kids had this and how they had that. And I seemed not to have any of those things. And I really wanted those things. And how I learned about keeping up with the Joneses. My dad, he gave me a very valuable lesson about not trying to keep up with the Joneses, understanding where you're from, understanding your values, your culture. And what I try to do with the book throughout is, yes, the book is telling my story, as in me, Sam, but I always aim to zoom out and then sort of give a descriptive analysis of what is taking place. We talk of politically, we talk of culturally, I talk of religion, I talk of politics. I'm trying to give a bright picture or a deep picture of the situation of Malawi and our culture, our rich culture. And I just happen to be, I guess, the antagonist. No, not antagonist, the protagonist. The main, yes, I just happen to be the main character in the story. But basically, I'm trying to tell a story of Malawi from a different light. And I end part one, talking about my college experience. And I begin part two with a vent, because I have a bone to pick with the world. I have a bone to pick with everyone, and how they look at Africa, and how they belittle us, and how there's this illusion that nothing good can come from Africa. But man, all the brilliance that is coming from Africa, and especially in our generation, the fact that Africa is the youngest, has the youngest population, and that, all the other nations, all the other continents, their birth rates have declined steeply. So this means it's now time for Africa to rise up and take up positions of leadership and, go on and take on the world and become the leaders. And so I vent a little bit, but my venting is not, out of spite, it's not out of malice, not out of hate. It's purely out of love for my countrymen, love for my continent, man, love for our culture, love for who we are. And I just want us to be looked at in high regard, the same way, we look at everyone else in esteem from the other continents. Not asking to become superior, no, not really, just asking to be put at a level playing field with everyone else. And I feel like at this point, we've earned it, we belong. And the world is a global village, and we need to understand that Africa is no longer the village idiot. Africa is now one of the champions, and we need to recognize that. So in my book, I try to bring that to the fore. And then I go on to share some other experiences. I talk on politics, I talk on religion, I talk on relationships, I talk about business, I talk about how I ended up an entrepreneur, and I talk about how a person can succeed. And ultimately, I come to the conclusion that in this here life, in order to be truly first class, a first class citizen of any nation, a first class citizen of the world, what you really need is the hand of God. You need purpose. You need to know where you're going. You need to know why you're here. And you need to strive to achieve that. And so I put all that together in this book, sharing my life, sharing my discoveries, sharing my treasures. And in this book, I firmly believe you, as the reader, you will in many parts find yourself. You will find your father. If you're from Africa, you find your father, you find your mother, you find your grandfather, your grandmother. And even if you're from the world, or wherever you find yourself, whatever continent you're from, there is a piece in this book that is going to speak to you. There is a way that is going to shape your perspective. It's going to turn your thinking. It's going to make you realize that at the end of the day, we are all more similar than the world makes it appear, that we are all citizens of the world, and that in every nation, you're going to have those that succeed, and every nation, you're going to have those that fail. And the formula for succeeding in most nations, in every nation, is pretty much the same. And it's going to make you question, it's going to make you think about eternity. It's going to make you think about not necessarily legacy, but it's going to make you think about what comes after this life. My 30 years on this earth, I've had the privilege of learning so much. I've had the privilege of experiencing so much, being born in Africa, but having the opportunity to travel. It's expanded my horizon. It's expanded the way I think. It's expanded the way I look at life. And so in this book, I try to package all of that in about 250 pages. It's not a long read, and I made sure to make the language simplistic so that someone reading from Malawi is going to understand everything that's being said in the same way someone reading from the UK or America or Spain is going to understand. But in here, I share treasures. I share not my story. I share the story of where I'm from. I share the story of my rich heritage. And it is a story worth reading. It is a story worth sharing. And so I highly recommend you to get yourself a copy of First Class Citizen of a Third World Country. And if you read it, let me know what you think. Give it a nice review. And let's spread the word. Let's spread the word. Everybody needs to know. Everybody needs to take this journey with me. And if you're watching this video, you're already along this journey with me. Read the book. Tell me your thoughts. If you've watched this far, I'd like you to hit that like button, hit subscribe, and don't forget to tell a friend about Thoughts of the Young Icon. Thank you very much.